The views expressed on Science for the People are not necessarily the views of this station, its affiliates, sponsors, or advertisers.
This week on Science for the People, we're talking about the culture of science, the difference between good and bad science, and how bad science may be a bigger problem than we think. Welcome to Science for the People. I'm Rochelle Saunders. With me is Michael Inzlicht, a research excellence faculty scholar at the University of Toronto. His primary appointment is as professor in the Department of Psychology, but he is also cross-appointed as professor at the Rotman School of Management and a research fellow at the Behavioral Economics and Action Group. He conducts research that sits at the boundaries of social psychology, cognitive science, and neuroscience. Michael, welcome to Science for the People.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so I'd like to start with the reproducibility project done by the Open Science Collaboration. Can you walk us through what that project was?
Yes, that's a very, very ambitious project, spearheaded by Brian Nosek, but who shepherded, I think, over 200 authors to replicate 100 studies that were published, I believe it was in the year 2008. So essentially what this team did was they identified 100 papers that were published in 2008 from 3 prominent journals in psychology. And it wasn't a random process, but in terms of how the studies were selected. But nonetheless, 100 were conducted in mostly in social psychology and in cognitive psychology. And these various labs from all over the world tried to replicate. Essentially, looked at the articles, tried to reproduce the methods. Sometimes or often consulted with the original authors to make sure they didn't miss anything from the original write-ups. And then they went about trying to replicate. So reproducing the methods, running participants through these various psychological paradigms, studies, and then, collected data and analyzed the results and compared the results, the replicated results with the original results. And the results were startling, to say the least. So in the original 100 papers, I believe let's say the main result of each study, I think almost all of them had a significant result. I think maybe one didn't. But almost all of them had, some take home. Look, we found this significant finding, and this means, so and so. It turns out when this was attempted, in terms of replication, only, I believe it was about 39% or 36% of the original findings could be replicated. And now there are a number of metrics used to evaluate whether something is replicable or not. And that number, that 36, or I'm not even sure the exact number now. That number varies depending on what metric is used. So it could be 30, it could be 36, it could be closer to 50%. It's not clear, but nonetheless, whatever it is, it's not at the level of replicability that we would expect. Now, I don't know what that number ought to be. Ought that to be 80%, 75%? I'm not sure. I think most people would say probably shouldn't be 100%, meaning that, yes, we are going to have some results that are going to be false leads. They're going to be false positives. That's a normal part of science. We need exploration. We need creativity. So we're not expecting to replicate everything 100% of the time, but we expect to have some degree of fidelity, probably a higher degree of fidelity than that, 36% that I mentioned. So this, in a way, is you can think of this as a stress test of the field of psychology, of social psychology, and of cognitive psychology. And I think it's fair to say that we did not pass the test. That many of our results did not replicate. They could not be reproduced, which then begs the question: well, how rampant are these non-replicable results in our literature? Is it possible that these 100 studies were, because they were not randomly selected, maybe they are not representative of, the field at large? That's something I highly doubt, but it's possible. Nonetheless, it asks a question, and I think the answer, the question of how strong, how robust is our field, and I think the answer is, not as robust as we'd like it to be, and I think it's a wake up call for many of us to do better science, to think more deeply about using methods that will generate results that are replicable in the future.
So why did this project come about? I mean, what prompted it in the first place?
That's a good question. You would probably want to ask Brian Nosek, who spearheaded this, rather than me. But I can give you some guesses. So in other fields, like in medicine, for example, John Ioannidis wrote a now very, very famous paper with a title, I'm forgetting the exact title, but it was something like, most results are false, suggesting that over half of published results in medical journals are most certainly false positives. And I think this was the mid 2000s when this was published. And Ioannidis, who was at Stanford, yes, he was looking at medical research, but I think the problems that he identified were also clearly relevant to other disciplines, including psychology. But I should note, I suspect that I will be talking mostly about psychology today. We should note that this problem is not psychology's problem alone. So psychology has got a lot of attention for this. I think mostly because we're doing these really ambitious projects, like the reproducibility project, where we're trying to replicate 100 studies. We have these massive attempts to replicate specific papers. So we're very, very, we're in the news a lot, but one could argue we're in the news because we're doing something about our problems. But other areas like medicine, like by certain branches of biology, like economics, other social sciences, they too face the same kinds of problems. And one could argue their problems are more problematic because the outcomes they study are, some could argue, more important. So if there's a raft of false positives in medical science, that's really important. These are life and death kinds of results that we're talking about here. So anyway, this was identified early in the mid 2000s, I should say, and I suppose Brian Nosek was influenced by the rumbling from statisticians in various fields, and started asking questions about the reproducibility or replicability of his own field of psychology.
So, sorry, keep going.
I'm just rambling, so you can go ahead and ask a question.
So what are these 100 studies? How are they chosen, and what types of studies were included in these 100?
So I think the inclusion criteria were published in 2008. They were published in one of three journals. These are three very, very prominent journals. So one was a general journal in psychology called Psychological Science, widely considered, one of the top journals in our field. It publishes papers in all kinds of sub-disciplines within psychology. A second journal was the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, the main journal for social psychology. And the third journal was the Journal of Experimental Psychology, Human Learning and Memory, I believe, which is one of the mainstays of cognitive psychology. And I think they, at first the idea was to replicate every single article that was published in that year, but that would be, I think, hundreds of studies. So in the end, they decided just to stop once they reached 100 studies. And how those were selected within, the larger corpus of studies within 2008, I'm not exactly sure. I think there was some self-selection. So some, I think authors who had an interest in a certain topic might have picked a certain paper. If they had expertise in a certain area, they might have been asked to replicate a certain project, etc. So it wasn't random. It is an important point here. And I think that's a legitimate criticism, because if it's not random, then one could argue that there was some sort of, there's something special about these 100 papers. Now, in terms of the actual content of any one of these studies, you're pressing my memory a little bit now. But I'll give you, there's one example I can remember. This was a study, I guess it was published in 2008 in Psychological Science, published by Kathleen Voss and Jonathan Schooler. I believe those are the two authors. And they found that when people were, led to believe that they did not have free will. So when they were primed with the notion that, our behaviors and actions are all predetermined, they then found that people like this were more likely to engage in immoral acts, relative to people who were not reminded or primed with these sorts of determinism beliefs. And this is kind of an interesting, very sexy study. It suggests that, our lay beliefs of whether we have free will or not can determine the extent to which we're moral or not. Well, it turns out when this was a replication was attempted on this study, it could not be replicated. And this is kind of important because that paper, the original paper, got lots of press attention. It's catchy. It kind of makes some sense. And it has some potentially broad implications. But yet it could not be replicated.
What other types of social psychology ideas have come under closer scrutiny since this project started?
Well, there's been a lot of now findings that have come under scrutiny. Whether they were included in this reproducibility project is something separate. So the reproducibility project, which we've just been talking about, the 100 study, attempt, that's just one very, very important, very, very prominent, and highly cited. It's been out for, I think, just about a year. It's been cited like crazy. But there are other, there have been other replication attempts, other means of, again, stress testing the literature. And these too have shown that certain findings have not replicated. So I'll give you some ones that I know well because I've been involved in them. So one that has also received a lot of attention is in this area called ego depletion. Ego depletion is a term. It's not a term that I particularly like, but it's a term to describe essentially when people are tired or when they're fatigued, when they no longer have the energy to go on and to engage in effortful tasks. So the idea here is that there's a model put forth by Roy Baumeister and a number of his students in the late 90s, suggesting that self-control relies on a limited resource. And when you use this resource to control yourself throughout the day, you literally use up that resource and you have less of it for later times. So a classic study in this genre of studies uses the paradigm they use is something called the sequential task paradigm, where people are given some effortful tasks. So, for example, they might be there might be a plate of freshly baked cookies put right in front of them, and then they'd be told, "Oh, you can't eat these cookies." So they have to restrain their impulses because these are literally freshly baked. The smell, the room smells like freshly baked cookies. It's very, very tempting to just grab one of those cookies. But participants are told not to eat them. And another set of participants, will have the cookies in front of them and are allowed to indulge if they'd like. And then afterwards, and then participants, they either restrain their impulse or they don't. And then afterwards, all participants will be given, for example, a second kind of test of control. So that'll be something like, how long they persist on some sort of tough puzzle. It could be a cognitive sort of reaction time task where we examine the extent to which they can inhibit, prepotent responses, the extent to which they can control their attention. And there have been over 200 studies, probably now closer to 400 studies that have confirmed this basic pattern. The basic pattern is that when people engage in a controlled activity at time one, they're less able or less willing to engage in a controlled activity at time two. There's a popular book written about this by Roy Baumeister and John Tierney, who's the science writer at the New York Times. It's a bestseller in the New York Times. I think it was published in 2011 or 2012. This is an idea that is so popular that a number of years ago, Barack Obama was interviewed for Vanity Fair, and he cited this research. as he started this research in terms of explaining certain kinds of behaviors he engaged in. So he explained, for example, that he essentially wears the same sorts of clothes. He's got 10 gray suits, and he doesn't really have to choose between them, because the act of choosing has been shown to drain this resource. And because Obama would rather preserve his resource and have this energy available to make other decisions, he'd rather avoid it. So President Obama was citing this research as an influence his behavior. So this is an idea that has had quite a bit of appeal. Well, it turns out that perhaps there is no idea there to follow. Perhaps, even though we've run 200 or maybe 400 studies now, it's possible that ego depletion is not a thing. It's possible that engaging in acts of control at time one, for the durations that you typically see in these lab experiments, like 5 or so minutes, does not have measurable downstream consequences at all. And that's kind of a massive, updating of our beliefs. Because this is an idea, like I said, that is not only popular, it has not only been supported by hundreds and hundreds of studies, it also, to some extent, makes intuitive sense, right? Doesn't it make sense that if you're working hard, or if you're expending effort, for a certain period of time, you're going to be tired, and then afterwards you're going to be less likely to expend effort? So it's an idea that kind of makes sense. Yet it's possible that there's no idea there. It's possible that there's no real solid grounding to that idea at all. And that's a really sobering thought.
See, this is, I think, where a lot of people start to get confused who are outside the community reading about this crisis that's going on, this replicatability crisis, is we hear that there are patterns where there's been lots of studies done about an effect like ego depletion. But also that now we're finding we're not being able to replicate, is it one study or all of those studies? What's actually going on here? There seems to be a pattern, and we've sort of reproduced the effect previously, but I guess not the original study. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yes and no. So, you're asking a really good question. So how do we know? How do we have doubt on 200 studies? Are people going about trying to replicate each one of those 200 studies? And the answer is no. So typically what happens is people will pick one study and they will try to replicate that study. And maybe not being able to do it. Or they might, there might be, it was just published, I believe, a month or two ago, an effort that I was involved in, where 24 labs across the world tried to replicate one specific variant of this, one specific study, from this ego depletion canon. And these 24 labs, and I think overall there were over 2,000 participants, who participated. And the overall meta-analytic effect was essentially zero. There was no effect. But you're right, it's just replicating one study. There are 199 others, or maybe 399 others. Do we need to go about and replicate all those? Maybe we do. But there are other hints that there are problems. So, first of all, there have been other now reports, published reports, where people were unable to replicate the basic effect using different paradigms, using different measures. Those also can replicate. There are also now these meta-analytic techniques. So a meta-analysis is essentially just, it's an analysis of analysis. So it's taking all the 200 studies, let's say, and, seeing, analyzing those. And when that's done, if you use standard meta-analytic techniques, you might say, oh, actually, there's a pretty robust effect here. It looks pretty good. But the problem is when you are only meta-analyzing published results, the key word there is published results, you are going to get a biased sample of the effect. And that's because of this nefarious effect, I should say, called publication bias. And this is, I think, a key thing to understand if you want to understand the replication crisis. The publication bias is simply the idea that journals, editors, reviewers, and even authors do not publish null results. So I want to repeat that. Okay. So in science, what we do is we ask a question. We examine, if we're doing experimental science, we'll collect data that bears on the question. And then hopefully we have some result that can then answer our question. If we use, classical statistics, we might have a yes, no answer. Is our hypothesis, has it been confirmed or not? Now, if you're only publishing results where the, hypotheses have been confirmed, that means you're missing all the results where the hypotheses were not confirmed, all the null results. Right? So, and trust me when I say that as a scientist, many of our results are null results. So, if I knew beforehand the answer to my question, I wouldn't bother, going about collecting data. The reason I collect data is because I have a certain degree of uncertainty about my hypothesis, right? But then what that means then is that I should be publishing my, my positive results, the ones that confirm my hypotheses, but I also should be publishing my null results, the results that do not confirm my hypothesis, right? But now because of this publication bias, so there have been estimates that in psychology, I think 93% of all published findings are positive, meaning 93% support the hypothesis. But that isn't possible, right? I mean, the truer state of affairs would be something like maybe 25% of all my hypotheses are confirmed by the data that I collect. But that means that, 70 odd percent of any one scientist's findings does not make it into the published literature. It ends up in the proverbial file drawer. So now why is this file drawer important? Why is publication bias important? Well, it's important because, let's get back to ego depletion. I told you about these 200 studies or 400 studies, whatever it is. Well, how many more studies were run in the world? Is it 50 more studies were run? Is it 100 more studies were run? Is it 2,000 studies were run? We don't know because they're not published. So what you get when you meta-analyze a field is you just get a snapshot of what of the published literature, but we also need to take account of the unpublished literature. And if the unpublished literature is large, and if it's also not just large, but maybe nulls or even with results that go against, let's say, ego depletion, well, then that will change our interpretation of how robust a finding is. So that's just one really, really important reason why the published literature could be really, really wrong.
There are other concerns as well around the ways that we're collecting data and some of the statistical power around the studies that have been produced. Can you talk a little bit about those problems as well?
Yeah, I mean there are many, many problems. They run deep, and I think right now we're seeing a massive correction because we've come to the realization that we've abused our inferential tools. By that I mean we've misunderstood what our statistics are supposed to tell us. And as a result, we've drawn erroneous conclusions, perhaps massively erroneous conclusions, perhaps conclusions that are so bad that, I and some others have said, maybe we need to start over. That's sobering, right? I mean, so psychology is not a particularly old discipline. And social psychology, especially my area, is not particularly old. Starting over is not, it does sound daunting, but nonetheless, there are true findings out there in psychology, but there are probably a lot that are not true.
And it's really hard to tell the difference between the ones that are and the ones that aren't.
Yeah. Well, it's hard, but it's not impossible. Mm. So there are clues out there about what is robust. So, for number one, are there direct replications out there? What are the effect sizes of certain effects? So I'll give you one that's, you can take home to the bank. So there's a famous study, task, called the Stroop task. Maybe some of your listeners have heard of it. It's essentially, a task where people are shown a series of color words. So they'll see the word red, green, yellow, blue. But now the key is that these words, are also printed in colors. Red, green, yellow, and blue. Sometimes the words, the color matches the semantic meaning of the word. Sometimes they mismatch the semantic meaning. And participants are simply asked to name the color, not to read the word. And what you find is that people have a harder time naming the color of these words when the semantic meaning and the actual color mismatch with one another. That's a robust effect. You can take that to the bank. That will reproduce over and over and again. And there's a lot, there's a whole lot of stuff, a lot of effects like that. But there's a lot of other effects that also don't replicate. But let me get back to your question about some of the other problems. So I think you use the word power, statistical power, and this is actually an important concept in any field that relies on statistics. That your studies themselves need to have enough statistical power. They need to have, and another way of saying that is they need to have enough people. If you're collecting people, let's say in psychology studies, or you need to have enough observations, to be able to to make correct inferences. If you don't have enough people in your study, you're very likely to miss out on small effects that are actually there. If you don't have enough people in your studies, your p-values. So p-values are, again, these. I'm sure your listeners have heard of these because they're all over the place in terms of these are again tools to make inferences about hypotheses. If you don't have a large enough sample, your p-values are really, really unstable, and that's bad because we rely on those p-values to make inferences. Typically, we use a p less than 0.05 as a kind of a magic cutoff, as a cutoff to say, okay, I now am willing to reject a null hypothesis. But if those p-values are really unstable because you don't have enough power, well, then what could happen is that PIs, experimenters, people running the studies, authors of papers, might be tempted to engage in what is now called questionable research practices, which these are practices which were previously encouraged, previously were thought to be okay. But these are essentially data exploration techniques to essentially move around your p-values. Okay, so you might, drop an inconvenient subject who is an outlier. So this is someone, this might be a participant who has an extreme score on something. And we definitely want to get rid of people or normalize extreme scores. But sometimes people might choose to take away, to take an outlier away that's an inconvenient outlier, but maybe not necessarily take away a convenient outlier. They might do things like use covariates in their analysis, which is like taking account of a third variable that might make their p-values look better, right? When theoretically they didn't predict these things in the first place. So there's a bunch of these techniques, these things that actually, in terms of data exploration, they're fine. It's fine. It's actually really important to explore your data and to really look at it from many, many different angles. But the problem is, we cannot label our exploratory analyses as confirmatory. And these statistics that we use, these p-values that I was mentioning, these are confirmatory data analytic tools. That means you have to go in a priori with an hypothesis, and then you have to verify your hypothesis. You can't then change your hypothesis and add different covariates and change your conditions or what have you, because that's now in the realm of data exploration. And now you're the amount of error that you might be, the degree to which you're making an error in your inferences increases substantially when you engage in these exploratory techniques. So in other words, I think, we didn't fully as a field understand, how some of these, what we now consider questionable research practices, how much they could lead us astray, how often they could, lead us to make erroneous conclusions.
So in a post you wrote about what's going on in social psychology specifically, you said, as someone who has been doing research for nearly 20 years, I now can't help but wonder if the topics I chose to study are in fact real and robust. Have I been chasing puffs of smoke for all these years? That was in February, and it was really evocative and a thoughtful way to think about how challenging it must be to be within a field that is getting a lot of media attention and a lot of scrutiny on the methods and the types of science that you do every day. So as someone in the thick of what's going on, how are you feeling about it?
Yeah, that's a good question. After I wrote that that blog post in February, I had a lot of friends come up to me afterwards asking, "Are you okay? Or is everything okay?" Or, I think people thought I was depressed. Now, I wasn't depressed because, I think that would, I don't want to belittle people who actually do suffer from depression. So, but I was distraught at the state of our field. I still am distraught to some extent at the state of our field. I guess what bothered me the most was not so much that we made errors, because, errors happen, and errors are actually important, because these are learning signals. And it's kind of funny, actually, a big part of what I study is the identification and emotional responses to errors, at the level of the brain. So errors are important because we can learn from them. Now, so I'm not bothered by errors, although I wish we had identified them a lot earlier. What bothers me is that it looks like in some corners, there's a denial that we've made errors. There's a denial that there's a problem, or there's a minimization of a problem. And that means that, again, there are certain corners of our field that would rather us, stick to business as usual. There are certain corners of our field that would, essentially are saying, "Hey, folks, there's nothing here, nothing to look at, proceed. Don't worry about all these, methodological terrorists, and go ahead and just, proceed as normal." And that to me is very depressing. It means that we're not learning, from our mistakes. But, maybe another way to answer your question is, how do you respond to the possibility that, things you are studying, might not be real? That's really hard. I think to some extent I'm lucky. I've got, eclectic interests. And so in that blog post, I talked about I've had, let's say, in my career, I've studied a number of things, but let's say there have been two things that have really dominated. So earlier in my career, I studied a topic called stereotype threat, which is a phenomenon whereby when people believe that their group is stereotyped, or that they become stressed out by it, and their behavior is affected by the emotional response to this fear of confirming a stereotype in the eyes of other people. So that's one thing I studied early in my career. That's what I did my dissertation on, and I've been rewarded handsomely for it, including having a job at the University of Toronto. And the second thing I've studied, and this is the latter part of my career, I've studied this phenomenon of ego depletion, which I've described earlier. Now, both those phenomena, but especially ego depletion, have come under quite close scrutiny. And some people would say, that these two phenomena are not real. These are false positives. Now, if I had only studied those two things, I think I would be lost. What would I do? These are two things now that some people are suggesting are puffs of smoke. But what does that mean about the 20 years of research that I've conducted? What do I do with that? Can I cite those papers anymore? Can I stand behind them? That's really tough. And now, so I'm 44 years old. So, yes, I've been doing this for 20 years because I started, almost 20 years, started grad school when I was 24. And I've got I got many years ahead of me in my career. So I'm a tenured professor. And I can switch topics easily, and I can study things that are more robust. I've got choices. Now imagine though, you were 55 years old. Let's say it's 10 years, let's say I'm 55, not 44. Well, now, I've got, still got plenty of time left, but it's like, it's harder for me now to look back at what I've done and say, I can just switch topics. It'll be really hard for me to admit personally that I've made these mistakes. And I think that's what you see, in the response to this replication crisis, is that the response is, I think, I don't want to say it's a hard line, but there appears to be a line separating those who are, let's say, more junior from those who are more senior. such that the more senior people are much more resistant to the idea that we've got problems. And the younger people are at least from my perception, seem to be much more accepting of this. So young people who are starting in the field are idealistic. They're in science for all the right reasons. They want to do good work. They're trying to approach truth. And if they're learning that these old, inferential tools, we've abused our inferential tools, well, they're very motivated to do the right thing. So they're all on board, or many of them are on board with these reforms, with these kind of new ways of doing things. And the resistance, though, is coming from who are the people who are the most powerful, the people who are the gatekeepers in our field, the people who are editors, the people who are presidents of societies, the people who are, on awards committees, etc. So it's really difficult. It's a hard time. And for me personally, I guess I'm lucky because I mentioned these two things that I've studied, but I studied many, many other things. And I feel, that at least some of the other things I've studied are quite robust and solid. So I don't feel everything I've done, is puff of smoke, but it's certainly a feeling, about some of the things that I've done.
It is, I think, watching it unfold, because it is quite loud in the media, especially if you follow a lot of science journalism. It is a very clear reminder that scientists are people too, and that all people make mistakes. And it must be so hard to look at your life's work and just wonder if that effort and all those years was wasted. And I don't think it is a waste, but it's hard, I'm sure, not to think that at times.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's I mean, it's kind of funny. So social psychology, has been rightfully criticized. It's at the heart of this replication crisis. But there are still concepts, there's still some truths that we've generated. It's not as if it's not as if everything has been puffed to smoke. I don't want to say that.
Right. We're not going to take the whole field and throw it in the bin.
but there are, certain concepts that we're seeing play out right now, right? So the concept of motivated reasoning, this idea, and this is even an old idea. David Hume talked about these, but it's been born by some empirical data as well. The idea that, reasoning, this logical reasoning is not this, necessarily this objective kind of, weighing of pros and cons, but it's actually motivated. It's more like a lawyer, right? So, there might be some bias that pushes the reasoning in one way or another. And that's what's, I think, playing out here, where you have, certain people who are, who have conducted, many, many years of research on a certain topic. And now it's coming into question. Well, they're motivated to protect their legacy. They're motivated to be right. And now they're going to use their intellect, and these are very, very smart people, to defend their past work.
Michael, thank you so much for your time today. It's been really interesting to watch the field over the last year, and I look forward to reading more about your research and following as social psychology figures out where its feet are and where to go next.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
And if you'd like to learn more about Michael Inzlicht or his work, we have links to get you started on our website, which you can find at scienceforthepeople.ca.
Science for the People is a weekly radio show and podcast that explores everyday life from a scientific perspective. We are a member of the Skeptic Network, a collection of blogs, podcasts, and video content focusing on science and critical thinking. To find out where Science for the People airs near you, or to listen to past episodes, check out our website at scienceforthepeople.ca. You'll also find links to support us at Patreon, to connect with us on Facebook and Twitter, and to subscribe to the podcast in iTunes. And now, back to the show.
This is Science for the People. I'm Rochelle Saunders. With me is Paul Smaldino, an assistant professor of cognitive and information sciences at the University of California, Merced. His research focuses on using mathematical and computational models to study the influence of culture on individual behavior and vice versa. Paul, welcome to Science for the People.
Great to be here.
So you wrote a paper with Richard McElraith titled The Natural Selection of Bad Science. First of all, before we get into what that paper was about, what prompted the two of you to do this research in the first place?
We thought it would be interesting to try to apply some mathematical modeling to science as a population process. So people have been talking for a while about things like replicability, the fact that some studies aren't replicating in fields like psychology and biomedicine. And people have gotten some great data cataloging this fact and just sort of making verbal arguments for what needs to be done. And then there have been some models trying to quantify problems in science a bit more formally, but those have tended to be models at the individual level, sort of assuming that there is an individual scientist and he or she is choosing a hypothesis to study, has methods that have certain amounts of flaws, the hypothesis is good or bad, and then looking at probabilities for how likely is this result. Should he or she publish a result based on their tests? How likely is it to be true? And what we wanted to do was say, well, science is not just individuals working in isolation. Science is a population process of a whole community or communities of scientists all choosing hypotheses and then attempting to publish these hypotheses in journals in which there is publication bias, and then there's replication. And replication is dependent on the published literature. And so there is a cycle of choose hypothesis, test hypothesis, attempt to publish, and then occasionally attempt to replicate things that have only been published.
Okay, so your hypothesis was that we are somehow incentivizing bad science on a more kind of population level. So what types of incentives are you guys seeing? Or do you think you might see?
I think there are a lot of incentives out there, but what we were talking about specifically in our paper were incentives to publish often, to publish in high visibility, high impact journals. A related incentive is incentives to get grant funding. Now, these are all things that to some extent should be incentivized, right? We want scientists to be productive, to produce research. We want them to produce research that makes a big impact and therefore deserves to be published in a high visibility journal. We want them to do research that is recognized by their peers and therefore succeeds in getting grant funding. But a problem arises when these kinds of incentives drive success to a large extent, so much so that early career scientists especially, and late career scientists who mentor and advise early career scientists, make the goal not necessarily doing the best science they can, but achieving these metrics because of the competition. So the goal is not anymore necessarily do the best science, but publish the most papers, get a paper in Nature, get a grant, not because I need the grant to do my work, but because I need the grant or I won't get tenure or I won't get hired. And our hypothesis that we develop in the paper is that these kinds of incentives over time drive the dissolution of the degradation of scientific methods by selecting for those kinds of methods that are best able to produce lots of papers and high visibility papers. So I want to unpack that a little more, but let me stop and ask if this is making sense.
Yeah, no, this is definitely making sense. So what your paper sort of does, based on my reading of it, is it takes the idea of biological evolution and uses that as a model to try and figure out how this natural selection is happening, or if it is indeed happening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we're not the first to make an analogy between biological evolution and cultural evolution. This is an area that is a small field that has been slowly growing for about 30 plus years. And sort of applying and developing models rooted in ecology and evolutionary biology, but also incorporating the cultural and social aspects of human beings to try to understand cultural change. So in this case, we are specifically trying to understand cultural change within the culture of science. So we built a computer model in which there is a population of scientists. These scientists, or we call them labs to reflect the fact that science is often a sort of a group endeavor, and the best unit might be a lab group rather than an individual. Each lab has characteristic methods that are related to their ability to find true results and avoid false positives. They have a characteristic level of effort or rigor. Now, basically, you can increasing effort, we assume in the model, decreases the probability of getting false positives. It means you're more likely to call a false hypothesis false and not get a false positive. Increasing effort increases your ability to weed out these false hypotheses, but it also means that individual studies take longer. And we also included in the model a publication bias. So we assume, which is generally true in the actual world, that it's easier to publish positive results than negative results. It's much easier to publish a paper that says, hey, I found something totally new, than, hey, I checked this thing out that I thought might work, but it didn't. So everything is, the only new knowledge I added is that thing didn't work. It
definitely sounds less sexy to say, I tested a thing and it didn't work.
Right, totally less sexy to publish, to say. Unfortunately, it's also a loss of information. So it makes it harder in the long run to assess the validity of a claim if you don't have all the times that claim was found not to work because people who are testing it didn't publish. And it's also hurting scientists by saying sometimes you can do really good science and have a good idea and it just doesn't work. And that's okay. So these are our assumptions, basically, that increasing effort decreases false positives but makes it take longer to do studies, and it's easier to publish positive results. We then assume that every so often an older lab would sort of stop doing science, and a new lab would join the community of scientists. That new lab was the methods of that new lab would come from a successful lab within the existing population. This reflects the idea that labs that are able to publish a lot are better able to attract graduate students, attract funding, and place their graduate students or have their methods copied by another lab because of their success. So we thought this was a pretty reasonable assumption, and that's basically the whole model, or at least the initial model that we did. And if you run these simulations, what ends up happening is effort just drops as much as it can, because labs that are able to publish more and produce more false positives are more likely to publish a lot of papers and have success, and therefore have their methods copied. So over time, not only is effort decreasing, but the amount of false positives in the literature is increasing.
It's also really interesting that you guys specifically did not include any variables to account for even a small minority of fraud or intent of fraud. You guys very specifically did not include that in the model.
Absolutely. Yeah, we wanted to point out that, yes, fraud occasionally happens, and it's a real problem when it does. But this isn't about a few bad apples. This isn't about, oh, I don't do that, so I don't have to worry about science, the science happening around me because I'm not intentionally gaming the system. This is a process by which the methods that that become selected for will be selected to produce more false positives. And this includes norms of understanding or misunderstanding. So some evidence for that is the fact that in a lot of science, p-values, which is the p statistic is a statistic that is used to determine, what it actually is whether or not the data that one sees is likely to have been generated by a particular model. And this is used as evidence often of whether a result is likely to be true or not. So you can say, well, on average, X is bigger than Y, and scientists often use the p-value to say, is it really bigger than Y, or is it just noise?
Right?
However,
is it just chance that we've got this result?
Exactly. Yeah. But there's been consistent misunderstanding of p-values. So in the 60s, again, a philosopher named Paul Smaldino and others pointed out there's a lot of problems with our use of the p statistic, and there seems to be a lot of misunderstanding of the way it's applied. This was again reiterated in the 80s, and just 2 years ago, the American Statistical Association published a big report saying there's widespread misunderstanding of p-values. Nobody seems to understand p-values. Our model suggests that there may even be selection for this misunderstanding, that individuals who misunderstand it and misapply it will be more successful than those who understand it really well, and therefore are more likely to be more rigorous in rejecting false positives.
So you guys also ran a version where you specifically tried to incentivize replications in this model to see what would happen if more replication, to try and generate more people replicating studies and a greater incentive to do that work. So can you walk us through that variation of the model as well and what you found there?
Yeah. So the initial results that of this sort of natural selection of bad science and the degradation of efforts, the increase of false positives, that all made a lot of sense to us that this would happen. But there's also a lot of talk about reproducibility, replication, and our question was, is the incentivization of replication sufficient to stop this whole process happening, to keep science good? Now, we're both very, very firm believers that replication is critical for doing science, for being confident in our results. So this isn't about whether or not scientists should do replication studies. Of course they should. This is about whether or not replication is enough to stop this process, this natural selection of bad science. So we decided to make things very favorable for this possibility. We allowed scientists to occasionally replicate, and at first we said, well, let's start with kind of realistic levels of replication. So there have been some estimates in some fields about 1% of every study published is a replication. So we started it at 1, but we let that be part of a lab's method, so that labs who did more could increase in numbers if that was selected for. And then we said, all right, well, let's make it very easy to publish a replication study. Let's make it so that whether or not you find the initial result or not, you can always publish a replication. It's worth something toward your prestige and likelihood of getting your methods reproduced, but it's just less than what a novel result is worth, because there's still incentives for novelty. We then said, all right, well, if you're the lab that published the initial study that's being replicated and it's successfully replicated, you should get a little bump too, because now your result is more solid. But if you're the lab that initially published the result and it fails to replicate, let's make it so this is terrible. This is catastrophic, that it's like nearly career ending. We don't actually think that this is what we should do, because even the best science occasionally will generate a false positive because of noise. But it was sort of a way to be as favorable to this idea that replication could stop the process as possible.
Right. You were trying to give it the best chance of succeeding.
Give it the best chance of succeeding, right? So we made it just terrible. So if you had a study that failed to replicate, your lab was very unlikely to pass on your methods to future labs.
The lion ate you.
Right, exactly. And what we found was almost no effect. That effort just plummeted, false positives increased. And replication increased a little bit, but not much. And so we thought, all right, well, that didn't work. Maybe replication isn't increasing fast enough. Maybe just not enough replication is happening. So that's why it didn't work. So we artificially imposed very, very high rates of replication. We made it so that some huge percentage of all studies were replications of previously published results. We did it so that 25% of all studies were replications, 50% of all studies were replications. And what we saw was that this did not succeed in stopping the natural selection of bad science, that this did not succeed in stopping the plummeting of effort and the booming skyrocketing of false positives in the literature.
So this is not exactly good news. This reminds me of a conversation, or of the conversation around education and using test scores as a way to judge the relative quality of teachers. I mean, teaching like science is a really difficult skill set to judge, but it seems like trying to create some kind of measurement or comparison score so that we can give limited resources to the right people, or attempt to give those limited resources to the right people, might be kind of feeding back on itself and causing us a lot of problems.
I think that's a really apt analogy, and one I've thought of myself. I think it really points out, though, how difficult it is to do assessment in some sort of complex social behavior. Like whether it be teaching or science or anything where there is competition and limited resources, and we need to figure out how to allocate them some way. But we are also busy people with limited resources, limited time, and we need some way to evaluate. The problem is when you have a simple metric like whether it's for scientists, the number of publications, the impact of the publications, or for schools, the scores on a standardized test, what you end up doing is you end up selecting for whatever methods can maximize those metrics, whether or not they're maximized intentionally or not.
Paul, thank you so much. A really fascinating paper, and I look forward to hearing more from you.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And if you would like to learn more about Paul Smaldino or his work, we have links to get you started, which you can find on our website, scienceforthepeople.ca.
Science for the People is produced by Rochelle Saunders and edited by Ryan Bromsgrove. Helen Quivalon is our publishing liaison. We get research help from Josh Whitten. Coordination and additional behind-the-scenes support comes from the enthusiastic Skepcheck Network team. Our theme song was written and recorded by Fractal Pattern, and its title is Binary Consequence. Science for the People is listener-supported. You can find us on Patreon, where you can support us with monthly donations in any amount. In return, we regularly post special patron-only extra content and after-show casual conversations with guests. This show is created in partnership with the Skepcheck Network, a collection of blogs, podcasts, and video content focusing on the intersection of science, popular culture, politics, and social justice. You can find out more about Skepcheck at skepcheck.org. The show is hosted by Rochelle Saunders and me, Desiree Schell.